Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We're just going to give it about 30 seconds here as folks flood into this Zoom link, and then we'll get started. But thanks for joining us. All right, let's get going here. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Naina Gupta. I'm the policy director here at the American Immigration Council. And thanks to all of you for joining us, given that there is a lot happening in this moment on immigration on many fronts. We're hopeful that we'll be helpful to you today in understanding the reconciliation legislative package that has been moving through Congress now for a few months. I'm thrilled to be joined by three experts, two from here at the American Immigration Council, and a third who's joining us, Jason Hauser, who'll be speaking shortly. Before we get started, as other folks jump on, this will be about an hour-long presentation. We will have 15 minutes at the end of this for Q&A that we'll take live, but you can ask questions while we're presenting today in the chat. We will do our best to answer those in writing or live, or possibly in follow-up. Obviously, as I mentioned, there's a lot happening in this moment in terms of the immigration system and impacts on non-citizens. Unfortunately, we cannot offer legal advice on this call, either in the chat or otherwise. So did want to make that disclaimer up top in terms of the questions we can answer today. We will be sharing in the chat in a moment an explainer resource that we put together at the council that offers more detail on what we're talking about today, which is this reconciliation legislative package. This is a spending bill that the Republican Party is working to pass in this moment. Just for some context and background for those who are new to this, reconciliation is a unique legislative process in Congress that speeds up the passage of legislation that's related to the budget, debt, or funding. It's been used in recent years by political parties that control Congress, and especially when they're also controlling the presidency. A distinct feature of this reconciliation process is that passage of the bill only requires a majority of both chambers in Congress, which is, of course, particularly important in the Senate, where we usually need 60 votes for passage. The provisions in this reconciliation bill are supposed to relate, as I said, to budget, debt, or funding. But what we've seen in the past from both political parties is that when a party is in the majority, they've often used this process and this bill, given its low vote threshold for passage, to push through policy changes that are a part of the controlling administration's agenda. There is a process in the Senate that will review whether the provisions in the reconciliation bill make policy changes that are so significant that they go beyond budget or funding, which is the parameters of this process. And those provisions could be stripped out before final passage. But there's no guarantee of that, and there will be work to be done to make various arguments as to whether certain provisions in fact make such kind of policy changes and are not closely tied enough to budget and spending. In terms of the state of play on the bill we're talking about today, this is H.R. 1, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. You've heard the president talk about this. It was passed on May 21st in the House of Representatives after many months of negotiations, and it's now being considered by the Senate. The Senate will probably make changes to the bill, and then we'll send it back to the House, who will accept, the members there will accept any changes, and then it will go to the president's desk. President Trump and his administration have set a goal of July 4th for signing this bill into law, but it is still unclear whether that timeline will be met. In terms of the substance of this bill, so Although today we will be focused on the immigration-related provisions of this reconciliation package, the provisions cover all aspects of American society and life. This is a bill that talks about budget and spending across federal agencies. The House version that's passed includes extensions of tax cuts, changes to Medicaid and healthcare programs that the Congressional Budget Office estimates could lead to 13.7 million people losing coverage. It pulls back support for student loan borrowers from low-income students and cuts food assistance by nearly $300 billion. As I said, today we'll focus on the immigration spending provisions included in the bill, particularly the unprecedented use of fees for applications for certain immigration benefits and protections, and the very high amount of funding that the bill pours into immigration enforcement. We will not, though, be talking about cuts to public and tax benefits for non-citizens. Those changes will, of course, have enormous impact on the lives of non-citizens, but we're not focused on those changes in this briefing. I do want to highlight that those changes that are important to note include limits to states' reimbursements for Medicaid if a state has chosen to give Medicaid to certain categories of non-citizens. We also see this bill imposing a 3.5% tax on remittances sent by non-citizens to their loved ones back home. And the bill takes away eligibility for public benefits from qualified non-citizens, including refugees, asylees, and survivors of certain crimes. Our partners at the National Immigration Law Center have resources on these issues. We'll be sharing that in a follow-up email. But for now, I'm excited and thrilled to introduce our first expert, Adriel Orozco. He is a senior policy counsel lawyer here at the council, and he will talk to us a bit about the specifics, the nuts and bolts of the immigration fee provisions that are in this reconciliation package. Thanks, Adriel.
Thanks, Nina, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So the House proposed bill includes dramatic fee increases for certain immigration benefits. I'm going to highlight some of them, but we have a great explainer that will be shared with you in the chat as well as afterward in an email that has a table where you can review the current fees and the proposed fees side by side. Before I get into the specific fees, it's important to note that the way the bill is written, these new fees may be charged on top of the current fees. It doesn't necessarily prescribe one way or the other. So these are new fees, which can also be compounded by being added on top of the current fees. All the proposed fees with very, very limited exceptions are mandatory. This means that people who are unable to afford them cannot request a fee waiver either with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services or the Immigration Court. And most of the revenues collected from these fees would go directly into the General Treasury Fund and not to support application processing. The result is that if these new fees will go into effect, they would create a pay-to-play immigration system where low and moderate income people will be effectively priced out of pursuing an immigration status they would otherwise qualify for. So broadly, these fees target particular populations. So first, they target three categories of people pursuing humanitarian protections. Those include asylum applicants, TPS holders, and parolees. For the first time in our country's history, it would impose an asylum application fee, which is set at $1,000. The fee right now is $0. It's free because folks who are fleeing from persecution usually don't have money to pursue. And even in the past, when there's been a $50 fee, that has been found as being problematic, given that the barrier that would create. The bill also proposes a $100 annual pending application fee for asylum applicants, essentially shifting the cost of the backlog to the applicants themselves. And it increases the cost of a work permit while simultaneously decreasing the current work permit validity period for asylum applicants from 5 years to 6 months. So we estimated that a person whose application is pending for 5 years with USCIS which is a generous estimate because the CIS Ombudsman report actually a couple of years ago indicated that right now the estimate is that an application with USCIS can span about 10 years. Well, if it's for 5 years, the applicant would have to pay about $6,450 for their application. This includes the actual application fee, the pending application fee, and the work permit, which would have to be requested at least 9 times. So to put that into context, this represents nearly 43% of a person's annual income who earns federal minimum wage working 40 hours per week. And the second group that is targeted are unaccompanied children. So the bill proposes imposing a new fee of $3,500 for all sponsors. It's important to note that the majority of sponsors are parents or other family members of unaccompanied children. So if the child is in immigration court proceedings, an additional $5,000 reimbursable fee will apply until the proceedings are completed. That means that it could cost up to $8,500 to sponsor someone's own child. In addition, the bill proposes a new fee for a special status called SIJS, which is for youth who are abandoned, abused, or neglected by one or both of their parents. This fee is $500. Right now it's exempt, means there's no cost. And SIJS can be a lifeline for unaccompanied children because it can lead to a green card. And then, of course, if you think about all these fees, there's a compounding effect. We know that unaccompanied children will likely be unable to find a sponsor, which means they'll remain in custody and will ultimately be unable to pay for relief, either for asylum or for SIJS. And then thirdly, I wanted to highlight some new fees for people in immigration court proceedings. So there would be a new $1,500 proposed fee for green card applications filed in court and for people pursuing a form of relief. That's specific for people who have been in the United States for at least 10 years, have US citizen immediate relatives or legal permanent resident relatives, and their relatives will suffer a very high level of harm if they are separated from their family. There are also new or increased fees that target a person's procedural rights in immigration court. For example, a person would have to pay a new $100 fee for requesting that their hearing be moved to another day, or what's known as a motion to continue. Right now, there is no cost for this motion. And even if a person is able to pay this fee, there's no guarantee the request would be approved. The most common reason a person would request a continuance of their hearing for another day, at least at the beginning of their case, is to find a lawyer. So this can have real severe consequences for people's ability to get representation. In addition, there are increased fees for motions to reopen or reconsider the decision of an immigration judge or the Board of Immigration Appeals. They would increase from $100 to, from $100 for immigration judge decisions or $145 from the Board of Immigration Appeal decisions, upwards to $900. These motions often have a 30-day timeline, and the ability for somebody to come up with these funds in such a short period of time can result in them losing access to their appeal and even losing access to even getting into the federal court system. So for context, if we compare the fees that people must face when they're filing a civil complaint in federal court, in Washington, D.C., the standard fee is less than half of the proposed fee. However, there is an option to file a fee waiver or what's called informal pauperis if a person cannot afford the fee. And there are no fees for motions in federal court. So it's very obvious that these fees are very tilted heavily against a very vulnerable population. These fees will price out people from pursuing relief, limiting overall legal immigration into the country, and has significant policy implications. And so that's what I have prepared. I'll pass it over to Erin.
Actually, I'm going to jump in.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry.
Thanks, Adriel, for helping us clarify that. So again, these are astronomically high mandatory fees for applications for immigration protections and benefits, but also to be in the immigration court system, making both fighting an immigration court case and applying for relief and protections effectively inaccessible, as Adriel said, for thousands of people. So now we're going to turn to you, Erin. Erin Reichlin-Melnick is our senior fellow here at the American Immigration Council. Erin, in addition to these high fees, This bill supercharges immigration enforcement by allocating an unprecedented amount of money to the Department of Homeland Security for immigration enforcement in this context of a mass deportation agenda. Could you give us a sense of what these numbers look like, how they compare to past dollar amounts, and what this might mean going forward?
Yeah. So, and once again, thank you all for joining this webinar. What we are seeing with these fees is, with the on top of these fees is new money for the government to carry out immigration enforcement. In total, the House DHS and judiciary bills contain over $150 billion for ICE and the Border Patrol. And on top of that, there is $5 billion in the Department of Defense budget bill for supporting immigration enforcement. Now, I'm going to want to start in some ways with what the biggest impact would be on the interior, which is how is this going to impact ICE's ability to detain, arrest, and remove individuals? Right now, the biggest sum in the bill for ICE is $45 billion for detention. And that is money that would have to be spent by the end of fiscal year 2029. So by September 30th, 2029. That is a staggering sum. Right now, ICE's detention budget is $3.4 billion, and that funds 41,500 detention beds. The Trump administration, in anticipation of the getting this money, has been massively overspending on detention. Reporting from the New York Post out today shows that they have apparently 53,000 people in detention, which is 4,000 higher than 3 weeks ago. They are shoving people into detention centers to the point that in some places, detention centers are running at 200% over capacity. Miami's Crone Detention Center, they're currently holding 1,700 people despite having a maximum capacity of just 600 people. And the conditions are getting worse as a result. But with this $45 billion, they would be able to dramatically ramp up detention beyond what the current figures are. When the Lake and Riley Act passed in January, ICE produced estimates that showed that if they wanted to massively expand detention, that they could theoretically get up to 75,000 beds in total, counting the ones they currently have, to detain people in traditional prisons. But anything beyond that, they would have to start building new soft-sided detention centers, which are enormously expensive. The estimate provided back in January is that it would cost ICE $195,000 per soft-sided detention bed to bring that capacity online. So they estimated back then it would cost about $15 billion to bring 76,000 new soft-sided detention center beds online. So if you look at $45 billion, you're looking at the possibility that the agency could bring, by constructing new facilities, upwards of 150,000 to 200,000 new detention beds online to detain people, which would be a sea change. It would make ICE a more well-funded detention agency than the entire Federal Bureau of Prisons. That is a sense of the scale we are talking about with this funding. Truly transforming ICE detention into a bigger prison system than the entire federal prison system. But it's not just detention. It's also arrest capacity. Right now, one of the biggest obstacles for ICE in arrest capacity is not just having to detain people and not having anywhere to put them, but it's having enough manpower. And this bill would provide $8 billion for ICE to hire 10,000 new officers. Not only that, but the bill would come with $850 million for retention and signing bonuses, which could be used to give tens of thousands of dollars to existing ICE officers to keep them on board. That said, I think we should be skeptical about ICE's ability to actually hire 10,000 people. There is currently a law enforcement officer shortage across the nation. According to studies done by law enforcement agencies, right now, a study of 1,158 US law enforcement agents, 80% of which were municipal police departments, found that 70% of them have recruitment shortfalls, and that agencies are on average operating with a 10% staffing shortfall. So there are not tens of thousands of people out there who want to be law enforcement officers, because if there were, there would not be the kind of shortage that we see right now. So even if ICE does get this money, it's going to take time for it to actually come online and for it to get the results. But nevertheless, this would be a dramatic increase in the manpower available to ICE. And we have seen some of this happen before. In the 1990s, in the 2000s, the Border Patrol increased in size from about 10,000 officers to 20,000 officers across the Bush administration. So we have seen massive hiring binges like this before, and it could theoretically happen again with this kind of funding. But it's not just hiring, it's also $14.4 billion for ICE's transportation and removal operations. That is a budget line item that ICE right now gets $725 million about, roughly. So we are talking a 500% increase in ICE's detention capacity, in ICE's transportation and removal capacity, most of which that money would go towards airplanes and to contractors. Because all of this would go towards essentially putting money in the pocket of private prison industries and private contractors, which do the actual detention and removal that ICE itself doesn't carry out. So right now, again, the entire transportation budget is less than $750 million, but then they would get $14.4 billion over 5 years. But beyond that, they would also get money to ramp up cooperation with local governments. $650 million for 287G agreements, money that would be used to support local police departments in becoming essentially agents of ICE. Now, it's not just detention and arrest, it's also removal processing. The immigration courts would get $1.25 billion, and ICE prosecutors would get $1.3 billion. These are only about 30% increases on an annual basis. So what we're looking at is a system where the adjudication bottlenecks of immigration courts do not get better. They get worse, because now there would be so many more people arrested and so many more people detained, but not a significant increase in the number of immigration judges and immigration prosecutors to hear those cases. So people could be held in detention centers for longer and longer periods of time as detention ramped up, but the judges stayed virtually the same or maybe only increased by a few minor amounts. It's not just internal, though, it's also the border. $51.6 billion would go towards border wall, which would likely be enough to complete hundreds and hundreds of miles, if not to wall off the entire southern border. We have already seen DHS announce in the last 10 days that they are going to restart wall projects in Arizona to build over 37 miles of wall in the Tucson sector and 12 miles of wall in the Yuma sector. There would also be $8.3 billion for the Border Patrol to hire thousands of new agents, to buy new vehicles and ATVs, and to increase the capacity of their detention centers at the border. And there would be $6.3 billion for beefing up ports of entry, which is honestly the least objectionable part of this funding. Ports of entry actually do need significant infrastructure improvements, and they could in fact improve screening of passengers coming into the United States. But so overall, we're looking at, again, tens of billions of dollars, which would transform the ability of US Department of Homeland Security to actually carry out deportations.
Thanks so much, Aaron. So many important numbers that you just quoted there, and I think they're very helpful in unpacking just what these dollar figures in the reconciliation package mean. That can be incredibly inaccessible for everyday Americans. I know we're getting some requests in the chat for follow-up resources with those helpful numbers. We will do our best to offer that data and information as a follow-up. But in the meantime, I wanted to turn to our next speaker, Jason Hauser. Jason is a former ICE chief of staff from the first 2 years of the Biden administration. He is a DHS counterterrorism official, a combat veteran, and he has been doing much work over the past several months in trying to help the public better understand what's happening in the context of immigration enforcement. Jason, I have 3 questions for you, but just, obviously these past few months, we've seen immigration enforcement agents target students, day laborers, mothers, our own neighbors for arrests in communities around the country. We've seen immigration agencies violate due process. The Trump administration has ignored court orders in at least 3 immigration-related lawsuits, all toward this goal of meeting arbitrary deportation quotas, most recently arresting people even at courthouses when they're following the rules, showing up for their cases as they've been instructed to do. So I think my first question to you, given some of the numbers we heard Aaron quote, in particular, from what you know, from your expertise, from your time at the agency, what could ICE realistically do with 10,000 more agents, and how might that unfold under this current administration?
Thanks, Dan, for the question. I appreciate it. You know, very specifically, just adding 10,000 more, whether ICE officers or deportation officers, as we're seeing playing out now, is not an efficient, it's not effective. One, as Aaron talked just briefly about on the administrative side of that, one, takes 12 to 18 months to bring a new deportation to vet an individual, to train them, to equip them, and get them field training in the field. To do that would take, quite frankly, years. And I think in this administration, which I'll get to more specifically, that's when you're going to see an over reliance on these punitive on all these other dollars that Aaron laid out to bring on contractors, untrained staff, and individuals to sort of augment the immigration enterprise, the enforcement enterprise, as you would say. But like, let's just quickly step back. And under the direction of this administration, this is about the political theater. This is about showing the punitive measures at all points, at every point. You know, as Adriel laid out, as Aaron laid out, at every point of the immigration system, we're going to be as punitive and drive fear into the communities as possible. And we see that even from the tactical level of ICE officers right now showing up on, doing arrests on Southwest airplane, airline flights with tactical gear and night vision goggles on, and then, in the middle of day, or going into restaurants and driving these issues. But bringing 10,000 more deportation officers on, well, one, if you just look at it from a law enforcement perspective, from an internal ICE perspective, you're going to burden these field offices to continue to sort of bring untrained and sort of green officers into these sort of very, very hot and very politically charged operations. And when you have an administration completely focused on quotas, when we talk about 3,000 arrests a day as being directed by the White House, it is forcing ICE officers into these situations to be the blunt instrument of political sort of like theater, and to be the punitive tool of the administration. And that is, as we all know, very extremely dangerous for migrants that are non-criminal, that are here, have status, they're legally here, and they're working through the process. And it's also very delicate and very can be very dangerous for law enforcement themselves. But we see this playing out now. Just for an example, when we see the operations that we've seen in Tennessee and in Minnesota, you see the blending of law enforcement agencies, some that have little to no background in sort of de-escalation of sort of like violent or conflicts within a community, or they don't have training in immigration law and enforcement. And you're blending these together, and they're going to continue to exponentially become more dangerous, and individuals are going to get hurt. So the idea, and just to step back, if you bring 10,000 more deportation officers on, and you use it where you're only focusing on quotas, targeting non-criminals, large collateral arrests, that doesn't provide more public safety, that doesn't provide more national security. And additionally, it creates that imbalance that Aaron and others have said so eloquently in the system, to where you're only seeing the immigration system through the lens of enforcement, in throwing people out of the country into very dangerous situations, maybe in their home countries.
Thanks, Jason. So what you're talking about is impact at the community level with arrests, impacts on ICE officers themselves, confusion amongst officers who are being used from other federal agencies in this context. So I guess my second question to you is, are these dollars a smart investment? Does ICE need this money? What else, if the Trump administration, is eager to put this amount of money into the immigration system, what else could be done with it to avoid some of this harm and chaos that you're referencing?
Yep. If we're just talking specifically about the idiocy of investing $45 billion over 4 years into prisons operationally for ICE, where they would be able to have those detention facilities, who's going to staff those facilities. There's absolutely no operational assessment that was ever done that would come up with a ridiculous number of that sort of dollars over that amount of time. That is somehow going to fix, whether it's sort of enforcement or removal throughput. It's at a bit of an absurd number. Additionally, as Aaron laid out, this most likely would be brought on to bring on soft-sided detention facilities for short-term staging in cities across the country, were extremely dangerous situations for both migrants and non-citizens and in law enforcement in these facilities. And quite frankly, the conditions in those facilities are inhumane because we've seen them in operations along the southern border. These dollars could be spent in dozens of other ways that could build out and fix the systemic issues that are within our immigration system that does create more accountability, more management, more oversight, investments in adjudicators and case management and more judges, resettlement services, like bringing on and supporting NGOs within the community that do provide assistance and oversight. And sort of, we've seen success with programs like case management that are extremely cheap, 90%. I think a lot of the numbers are 90% compliance with a lot of those programs and only costing, $7 a day per migrant. Instead, we're going to lump that money into detention. That is not one, if the actual goal, to what I always assert, is this about supporting our communities? Is it about public safety? And is it about national security? Bringing on detention at this scale meets none of that. And what we have here is in the larger context is an absolute turn away from focusing federal law enforcement on those threats to our communities. This has nothing to do with individuals that are coming here to provide for their families or thrive or seeking safety. It has to do our communities, which are bipartisan, is we want our communities to be, we want to go after drugs, sex traffickers, human smugglers, terrorists, people that actually cause our communities harm. And all we've seen in the last 90 to 120 days is the turning of all of our federal law enforcement away from those mission sets. There's plenty of, it is now coming into context that like joint terrorism task forces and high intensity drug interdiction task forces that take both state and federal coordination are being turned off. And as you continue to proliferate this sort of immigration enforcement enterprise that is only now focused on the lens of arresting, detaining, and quickly removing and stripping away due process for migrants, we're going to continue to get away from going after those threats. You see that with Homeland Security investigations turning away from many of their cases that they've been working for years. You see that on the focus of the FBI and DEA. You're going to continue to see it where state and local law enforcement continue to move away from going after sexual offenders and drug traffickers in our communities, and now they're going to be supporting ICE. And what I would say, for all that money that could be, we can build a system. You could actually build the type of the multi-leg stool that is the immigration system. We could balance that out and create a sort of system that Americans will be proud of, could provide for our communities. It will have enforcement. We will need detention in some respects, but we have to build that out. But right now, putting all of these dollars into that, into logistics and transportation and moving detainees and hardened planes for removal, as we're jerking people out of legal status and we're removing them quickly and hastily, is absurd.
Thanks, Jason. So let me just end with one question, which you've already touched upon a bit. I think there are obviously a lot of folks who are listening today who are, trying to figure out, how is this going to hurt people on the ground? What is it going to mean for US citizens, for our communities? You've talked a lot about, from an agency perspective, what it means to divert resources, from a system perspective, what it means not to address the 3.7 million case backlog we have, and instead to put dollars here. But just in short, how do do these funds harm public safety? How do they undermine public safety beyond even just the diversion of resources you've talked about?
the sort of proliferated expansion with these dollars, with the directions of, targeting non-criminals, the most vulnerable, collateral arrests, and just blanket quotas of arrests coming from the White House will continue to create distrust. It will continue to degrade the sort of the belief in the public's view of our federal law enforcement, not just ICE. We're beginning to see that in some of the events that occurred in Hennepin County over the last couple of days and elsewhere. And this sort of over focus on targeting the most vulnerable migrants that are here legally, they were vetted, they were screened by law enforcement, they hear they have status, and then sort of creating this sort of like enforcement, enterprise and system that's just about the removal of migrants as quickly as humanly possible, inhumanely, and doing that in a way where they have ICE and immigration enforcement officers doing that with sort of this like shotgun approach of sort of swooping in and targeting large volumes of people and then sort of sorting it out later, is one, it's inhumane. It takes away from the public safety national security mission that law enforcement has, and it's going to continue to drive the distrust. And you're going to continue to see, when you have law enforcement being used as a political tool, you're going to continue to, and you do it at this volume and with this sort of, in this inhumane way, we're going to see a very, what could be a very violent period over the next 6 to 12 months.
Thanks, Jason, for offering your perspective and expertise to help us get a sense of how this might actually go. We have a lot of great questions in the chat, so I'm going to start lining them up, asking a couple of our speakers to jump in. Any that we don't get to, we'll try our best to respond to with the resources we share. So first, I know we had a question about the use of these dollars for private contractors for the expansion of immigration detention, and what this might mean with regards to those contracts, what we know about those contracts, are they public? So maybe, Adrielle, if you could get us started to just give folks some sense of, this $45 billion for immigration detention that we're talking to, who's going to get that money, and how, as the public, do we take a look at where those dollars are going?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nina. So I think it's important to also emphasize that, even before this bill has, hopefully it doesn't pass in this form, but before it's even passed, ICE is actually actively looking out for contracts to open new detention facilities. And it's important to also note that 90% of people in immigration detention centers are in facilities run by private companies. So either the private companies themselves can own the facilities. Often they're repurposed from prior prisons to now being used as civil immigration detention centers, or they can also be in a collaboration with counties. And so, unfortunately, there isn't a way to have instant access to some of these contracts until after they're entered into. ICE does have a website. It's called their FOIA library. It's based on the Freedom of Information Act request, where they do publish some of their contracts. So that is one way people can try to see if they can get more information about detention facilities in their communities, to see how much is being paid. Some of these contracts include guaranteed minimums. So even if all the beds aren't being used, there is a cost to the contract. So there's a lot of information folks can get from that particular website. But it's important just to note that there's not always instantaneous access to these contracts. And it's unfortunately, one has to wait and see if ICE will publish it on this website to be able to review it.
Great. Thanks so much, Adrielle, for sharing that. And we will add resources in the follow-up email about that contracting process. We are in a moment of decreasing transparency and oversight with this administration. Jason, you alluded to oversight. We've seen the Trump administration end and terminate the offices within DHS that have traditionally been charged with monitoring conditions in detention facilities. They have a mixed track record of being effective in managing conditions, from the perspective of many of us who followed that over the years, but nevertheless, that oversight has been terminated. We had another question, and Aaron, I'll give you this question if you want to jump in. Can you talk more about these dollar numbers and investments and how they will impact the continuing erosion of due process and the potential for wrongful deportations? How might this impact what we've already been seeing on that front?
Yeah, I think Jason talked to somewhat about this already, is when you have these quotas, when you have these huge scales, as huge sums of money, you inherently get into a situation where you have basically a demand from the agency to ramp things up. And when you have this demand to ramp things up, that is inevitably going to result in corners being cut. That is a significant issue that we are already seeing with policies and procedures that are in the place for a good reason, like detention standards, being ignored. There is no reason right now that we should have the kind of violations of detention standards that we're seeing, but for this administration's desire to significantly ramp up detention very quickly with very little oversight. And I think that is what we are already seeing. And as this money comes down, the administration has the incentive to spend it quickly, because 5 years is a blink in the eye when it comes to spending $150 billion. Trump, in his first term in office, spent $15 billion on the border wall. So this is, more than 3 times that amount of money to spend on border wall, $45 billion for detention. You're going to have to be building new detention centers, and you're going to have to cut corners if you want them to come online anytime while Trump is still in office. So even if they get this money tomorrow, it will, as Jason said quickly, 18 months just to get an agent on board, hired, onboarded, trained, and ready and out in the field. So if they get the money tomorrow, they are not even going to be able to start getting these agents in the field until after the 2028 midterms, 2026 midterms. And so that gives you some sense of like why they will then have to want to spend this money really quickly, which means they're going to want to cut corners, which means due process is going to be tossed aside.
Thanks, Aaron. I wanted to give the next question to you, Jason. We had a question in the chat about the recent use we've been seeing in the media, news, and in experiences of loved ones of ICE agents and immigration enforcement agents wearing face masks that cover their identity when they are engaged in community enforcement actions. Can you tell us a bit about how you see this practice, but also, what you know about ICE's policies on this front, whether this is necessary? And I'll just add, from the perspective of anybody who has represented non-citizens who could be targeted for immigration enforcement, when we educate communities on their rights, we tell them, if you interact with an ICE officer, these are the things you don't have to share. These are the things you don't have to tell a law enforcement agent about your citizenship status. But the challenge we're seeing on the ground is that folks don't know whether somebody is necessarily an ICE agent or not, because we're seeing folks, in plain clothes, sneak up in masks. And that has been confusing at the community level, even for communities who've been educated on their rights. So if you could just give us some context on the use of masks, on plain clothes, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, Nina, like you said, like the use of mask or any sort of tactical equipment or sort of dress is a policy. There's no law that sort of directs sort of as a requirement. And one, I will get to the tactical operations of this. We're seeing the proliferation of this, and the use of masks normally is in situations when that there was some sort of tactical like flashbang or gas that would be used in a situation, sort of like in being able to protect an officer from gas or tear gas, quite frankly, and those sort of things. But the use in this regard, ICE officers are making the claim, and the leadership in the White House is making the claim that it is for protection of the individual and the persons, because they could be doxxed online or targeted, right? The individual themselves. But what I don't see is true is sort of these assertions that this is sort of for, tactical safety in the situation, or like for some other reason. Because one, that doesn't hold true just in the way that deportation officers harass and sort of carry out these operations. For example, you could always say is you'll see deportation officers in hoodie or in sort of just like typical blue jeans and sneakers. Their uniforms, their Kevlar, their body armor is not uniform. Not everybody has the same equipment. They carry different weapons with them. Some of them are personally purchased. So there's no clear standards and requirements for those things. And quite frankly, a lot of those things that they're wearing are both dangerous for accountability, but it's also very dangerous for officers. Like, imagine a situation where there is unrest, where there is a riot in a community during an ICE action, and an officer has a hoodie on or he has a non-standard lanyard. They could be grabbed and jerked and hurt in those sort of forms. But so there is that, and that is a bit of the performative art of this. I do believe that there's ICE officers that are being directed to carry out these actions that do not want to be a part of them, and they are scared for their persons or for their families. Like that is something that goes through an ICE officer's mind. But there's also the piece of this where there's no need in some of these actions for special response teams, like SWAT teams that ICE has, to be wearing these large scale, military style special operation forces helmets, night vision goggles, and some of the tactical weaponry that they're bringing with them. Additionally, I foresee over the summer and into the fall, you're going to see the ICE in different parts of the country, the administration, not ICE, roll out other National Guard armored vehicles and other type of SWAT team, equipment, to just show and drive fear in the communities, that they want it to look as militarized in a sort of, in sort of that militaristic way, that like Call of Duty way. And none of that has to do with keeping us safer. And quite frankly, some of these actions make it less safe for, of course, for migrants, but also for law enforcement. But just to the point of masking, there's policies or verbal direction that it may be being given, or just the approval for the field offices to make their own call what they wear. And that again is what ICE needs in the future in any immigration enforcement, is standardization of these type of policies. What is best for the migrants? What is best for accountability and notification of who is a deportation officer, who is not, to make sure that the officers are held accountable to the same degree that the migrants or the non-citizens or just the citizens that are interacting are held when they interact with law enforcement. And it's a bit of a double standard.
Thanks, Jason, for talking a bit about that use of masks. So we have a question that's somewhat long in the chat, but that echoes other questions we're receiving, which is, for folks who are listening, how should we respond to this bill in terms of communicating with elected officials? Is the goal to amend the bill, remove the worst parts, to try to kill it? What is the criticism that senators are hearing about the most? And so I will get us started, and then Adriel, if you want to jump in, that would be great. I think just to offer some context, here at the American Immigration Council, we are doing what we can to remind Senate offices that many of the changes we're talking about, particularly those fee changes that Adriel laid out for us, are really sweeping policy changes masked in dollar amounts. These numbers, charging $1,000 to apply for asylum, charging hundreds of dollars to get work authorization, but then to renew it every time. Those numbers are prohibitive enough that they effectively stop people for pursuing legal relief that they actually qualify for. And that means we're getting rid of that legal relief. And that kind of change should be in a legislative package. That's not reconciliation. And those are the arguments at the council that we've been equipping Senate offices with. Now, And I'll let Adrielle add more to that. But, you know, what I'll say is in terms of everyday Americans and the public, you know, this is a bill that, again, as I mentioned up top for those who joined late, will strip dollars away from core American programs that serve lots of folks, that will hike up taxes. Those provisions are more contentious in the Senate. There are some Republican senators who are hesitant to support those provisions. The louder the pushback on those, in addition to those being contrasted to this overspending, this overinvestment of immigration enforcement, that trade-off, that comparison is what we hope people will be echoing to their senators and to congressional offices. But Adrielle, what did I miss?
No, I think the only thing I would add is that, you know, time here is our friend. I think what we are able to do now is we're able to highlight a lot of the things that these bills include and what their impact could be. And then also just seeing the context of what we've been talking about, what we're seeing on the streets, so that we're able to highlight what more funding for ICE right now could lead to. It could actually worsen what we're seeing on the streets. And so I think that that time is our friend in the sense that we're able to bring those up to our senators, from members of Congress, to be able to at least focus and say, look, this is what the impact is if we give this money, if we invest this money, we direct this money to the immigration system. I think it is important to note that right now, immigration funding isn't the most highlighted thing about these bills, right? There's all these other things that are impacting folks, like cuts to healthcare, cuts to SNAP benefits. And I think it's really important for us to think more broadly about this bill as well and how we're connecting all of these together. And that's why it's important to highlight that, you know, the fee increases would essentially create a wealth test for people to actually get access to benefits they otherwise qualify for. So I think it's just really important to also think about the broader context of this and to slow this down so that we're able to create more knowledge about what this bill would mean for our communities.
And for any of you that are on the council's lists, we are circulating a take action where we're encouraging folks to reach out to their Senate offices. So you'll be receiving that as well. Maybe we'll take 2 more questions and then we can end. And again, there will be a recording of this sent along with our resources, including our explainer on the immigration provisions of this bill. So Erin, a question for you. Are there any mechanisms to hold the federal government accountable when they continuously fill more detention beds than they are funded for, the way that you described? Is there a possibility that they could reach the number of beds you mentioned, 150,000 to 200,000, even if they fall short of this funding that they're requesting, or it takes time for them to spend it? And how do we hold them accountable on that?
Yeah, let me take the second part of that first, which I think is a little bit easier. Of course, if they don't get this funding, if the reconciliation bill doesn't go through, no, they are not going to be able to detain 150 to 200,000 people. They are already overspending. There's multiple reports that they've already said that they are effectively out of money on the detention front. They've already had to pull hundreds of millions of dollars from other parts of the Department of Homeland Security just to fund this. And unless Congress gives them the money, they will eventually run out because these are contracts. You know, ICE only operates a small handful of facilities that it itself owns. Nearly all of them are owned by private contractors or state and local governments who are contracting with ICE, and all of them need money, otherwise they will cancel their contracts for noncompliance. But you know, how do you hold these accountable? Well, one, oversight. Congress can do oversight. Members of Congress can go to these detention facilities and see conditions themselves. We have seen, of course, the infamous incident that happened a few weeks ago outside of Delaney Hall in Newark, where a member of Congress and the mayor were arrested. But the members of Congress have an absolute right to conduct oversight visits, and we strongly encourage you to talk to your own members of Congress if there's a detention facility in their district or people from their district are being sent to specific detention centers. It is not limited to only a detention facility in that Congress member's district. Any congressperson can go personally to any detention center, or they can send a staff to any detention center with 24 hours of notice. So Congress plays an important role here, one that doesn't matter who is in the majority. This is any individual congressional office has this authority and do not need to be in the majority in order to exercise that. So the power of the bully pulpit. And then secondly, I think lawsuits. We are likely going to see lawsuits when they start continuing to detain people in deplorable conditions. At the American Immigration Council, years ago, we helped win a lawsuit against the Border Patrol for holding people in conditions somewhat like what we're seeing ICE hold people in conditions today. There are people being held in the Baltimore field office with no beds, with no toothbrush, with no toothpaste, with no access to showers, in conditions that looked a lot like what people were held in at the border 10 to 15 years ago. That is unacceptable. It's a violation of the Constitution. And as this continues, I do expect to see lawsuits come out. And beyond that, of course, it's just pressuring local leaders not to sign these contracts. One of the reasons is there are tens of thousands of beds sitting around in local jails. Those are beds that do not have to be given to ICE. So pressure on local governments and local law enforcement officials not to give away their own detention space to ICE can also make a difference.
Thanks. Jason, did you want to add to that? I saw you want to.
Just to piggyback with Aaron, it's about accountability. And as detention facilities are being brought online across the country, it is about not only the federal and congressional, but also state and local requirements for these facilities. Additionally, for the busing and the logistic support that will go around, that will be brought online. If they bring on a detention facility, they're going to be needing bus services or logistics companies and sanitation companies and food service companies, creating accountability in local, state, and local zoning and law and ordinances to make sure that that they meet the standards that American people would want. Additionally, and just quickly, we are entering, outside of immigration enforcement, in my view, a time in America that is we're going to see increased risk of sort of both extremist activity, violence, sort of individuals that do want to hurt our communities. And the federal government has taken the eye off that ball. We need state and local officials, state and local law enforcement to begin creating accountability about what is being lost because of this indiscriminate focus on non-criminal migrant arrests. There was going to be more drugs. There is going to be more human trafficking. There's going to be more potential for extremist activity, like we saw at the fertility clinics in California, or we saw in the violent attacks at the Israeli embassy, or we saw in Florida recently. We are going to see more of that in this period outside of immigration, and our law enforcement needs to be held accountable to be protecting us from those threats, not targeting those that are coming here for a better life.
Thanks for that, Jason and Aaron. And we put into the chat, in addition to our resource on this reconciliation legislation, an action item. Please join us in asking Congress to vote no on this bill. I think many of you have asked the right question, which is, how do we get Congress to really understand the extent of harm that these immigration-related provisions pose? How do we get them to care about that, given where polling and the public stands on immigration? And the first step is ensuring that members of Congress are hearing from all of us, and that all of you are educated and sharing the information we've shared today. So you can click on our Take Action and join us. Thank you for attending. And for those of you who are still on, we will send again a follow-up email with a link to this program, as well as additional resources. And thank you to our three speakers. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Thanks.